Are there 20 men in Europe happier because of what they have learned from Aristotle? What are Descartes' vortices compared to the whirlwinds in men's bowels? What is Newton's mutual attraction of matter by comparison to matter's mutual repulsion with its cruel distensions? Can the pleasure of a few philosophers, when they gaze on the 7 threads of light separated by the Newtonian prism, compare with the ease and comfort every living man might feel 7 times a day by discharging freely the wind from his bowels, especially if it be converted to perfumes? So many thus pleased by the delightous smell. Such benevolence, he says. In the spirit of Martha Stewart, he says, well, then generous souls, who now endeavor to find out whether the friend he entertains likes best claret or burgundy, champagne or Madeira, would then inquire also whether they chose musk or lily, rose or bergamot, and provide accordingly. The freedom, he says, of expressing one's sentiments is infinitely more important to human happiness than is freedom of the press or freedom of abusing one another, for which the English are so ready to fight and die. Indeed, this invention, if completed, would be, as Bacon expresses it, bringing philosophy home to men's business and bosoms. By comparison to the universal utility of such a project, says Franklin, the science of all the philosophers mentioned and the mathematical question posed by the Academy are altogether scarcely worth a farthing, only he spells it with a dash between the T. Now, you have to be pretty stuffy and a big sourpuss not to laugh at this hilarious joke. Bringing philosophy home to our business and bosom. He's not talking about our bosom. Guess again. And so, you know, when I first read this, I couldn't get the image of a state dinner filled with elegant diners, eating foie gras and drinking fine wine and gassing each other with their intestinal perfumes, often loudly. Now, this hilarious spoof has a serious side. Modern natural science will disclose the truth about the world, as Bacon said. What we can do with nature tells us what nature really is. But even the disinterested pursuit of truth turns out inevitably to be turned to our interests and our business, because scientific truth produces ever greater practical powers at our command. Franklin suggests, by this wonderful story, that we should have no illusions about the nature disclosed by modern science, nor should we have any about the object of scientific benevolence, about the dignity or greatness of the creature, us, to whose interests the courses of nature will be bent. The latent possibilities of intestinal gas are no less dignified or important than the general laws of motion or the courses of the stars and the planets. And we, the beneficiaries of natural science, are, among other things, flesh and blood and brains surrounding an elementary canal. And we are thus as likely to want mellifluous gas as we are to sacrifice for such things as freedom of the press. With these conclusions, Franklin brings us high and mighty conquerors and masters of nature down a peg or two. And thus he reminds the rationalists that the believers who fear our playing God have a serious point to make. Modern rationalistic human beings should be careful not to think too well of themselves, as if rather than playing God, they become convinced that they are. Now, it would be useful, if I might take just a minute, to close by with some conclusions by reflecting on a recent public issue between rationalists and fundamentalist believers, the issue of intelligent design and the teaching of it. And there was a recent court case in which a hapless school board in Pennsylvania was defeated and they couldn't do this. Franklin often commented that reflection on the good order of the world could lead reasonable people to conclude that the world is made by intelligent design, which would mean, of course, the 6 days look at God, or in the case of the Pennsylvania school board, God's long, slow evolutionary plan. But Franklin concluded that in theological matters, we should be careful of what we wish for. The well-ordered world contains some uglier features, such as the miseries suffered daily by human beings, innocent and guilty alike. If the world is so intelligently designed, why does it contain such misery? For Franklin, answering this question leads to some dubious conclusions about the designer. Franklin actually wrote a piece about intelligent design when at 19 in London he wrote an essay called ominously A Dissertation on Liberty and Necessity, Pleasure and Pain. He argued that if we think of the world as created by an omniscient, omnipotent, and wholly benevolent God, it must follow that virtue and vice don't exist. Such a God must approve of all the things we do, since after all they spring from his creation, and since God would not approve of vice, otherwise known as sin. It follows that the world as we find it, with all of its supposed vice and misery for us human beings, must be the best one it can be, because the thrice perfect God could not possibly have botched his creation. And if the divine order is the best it can be, then it follows that God does nothing to intervene in this world or in the next to change human affairs. Despite the essay's powerful logic, and everyone who believes in intelligent design should have a look at it, Franklin soon burned most of the copies of this essay because he said it was sure to corrupt his friends. If it didn't get him in trouble with Orthodox believers, it would surely corrupt his friends and others. So Franklin concluded that while the believers in intelligent design, the deists were such people, I mean, this was really commonplace. Franklin thus concluded that while the believers in intelligent design didn't really understand the implications of what they believed in, it still wasn't such a bad thing for them to teach this doctrine, properly misunderstood, so as to allow for God's intervention in the world and the next to be young in church. So to today's partisans of religion and reason, I think Franklin would say a plague, or maybe a bad cold, on both of your houses. I think he would argue as follows, that intelligent design is nothing but creationism in disguise and it shouldn't be taught as science. But Franklin, who proposed, albeit with his fingers crossed, that prayers be offered before the sessions of the Constitutional Convention, wouldn't gloat too much at the fate of the hapless Pennsylvania School Board. As regards the issue of religion and public life, Franklin mistrusted enthusiastic rationalists as much as he did enthusiastic believers. I say it for a third time. He always worried about political oppression by the clergy and thought that wise policy should keep the clergy as far as possible from politics. But he would not then think it wise to despise and humiliate those who long for the clergy to rule, especially since the despisers are often as bullheaded as those they condemn. So he might perhaps propose to give the believers some ground. And so he might have advised that in our public schools, teachers should be obliged to say something like this. Science says the world is matter in motion. Faith says the world is God's 6 days or 17 billion years' work. And there is no way for the evidence of one falsifiable hypothesis and experiment to bear on the evidence for the other, the experience of the spirit within. For all you believers, I think he'd say, science isn't your good friend, but neither is it or can it be an enemy that can defeat you. So don't teach intelligent design as science, but also don't be ashamed of your belief, and thus, because of that shame, pony up to the evidentiary bar of natural science. Franklin convinced himself that the issue in the debate between reason and revelation was an issue of mistaken evidence. The evidence for natural science is one thing. The evidence for an internal experience is another. And Franklin and Hobbes had always tried to explain one in terms of the other, and Franklin didn't think that was a doable project. In managing the politics of faith and reason, Franklin, who was the second greatest scientist of his generation, always preferred artful balance, what I like to call improvised design. He did not think the project of science he so loved would be loved by all, especially when it started stepping harder and harder on the toes of the believers. That's why if he could have lived 1,000 years, I think he would not have expected to have been freed from the need to manage this tension between science and technology and modernity on the one side, and religious faith and enthusiasm on the other. For Franklin, technological progress is good, but we cannot make it, we can't count on it to make everyone see eye to eye about the matters that most concern morality, especially the issues of the soul, God, and miracles.